Hey everyone, so here's the first round of notes for the weekend. So once you've understood all the names of the superhighways and the highways and the back roads that get blood to where it needs to be, we then have to look at what happens when it gets to where it is. And that's what we refer to as tissue fluid exchange, right? And if you look at an artery and a vein, and you look at those multiple layers of tissues, we can see that like this is not the location where diffusion and exchange of stuff takes place, right? Diffusion and exchange of materials occurs at the capillaries, and so that's our area of focus. But there's the structural relationship of these three vessels that's fundamentally important to how this exchange takes place. And so that goes back to where we briefly introduced, well, not briefly, but we basically described in this section of notes the structure of each of these different vessels and how that structure serves function. So we're going to review that and tie it into how tissue fluid exchange occurs. So first off, recall that arteries branch into smaller arterioles, right? And so here we can see this is a thicker, much bigger artery, which eventually gets smaller and smaller into an arteriole, and that eventually leads to our capillaries. All right, and as we look, we can almost see that the capillary is also divided in itself in terms of what we call the arterial end of the capillary here, and this side, which we call the venule end, because capillaries essentially will drain into venules, right? And those venules, smaller, will eventually lead back to veins. And so that's sort of this layout here, right? Where we have arteries into arterioles, into the arterial end of the capillary bed, into the venule end, venules, and essentially into veins. And the structure of each of those all set up the sort of requirements to allow materials to be exchanged. So that's what we're looking at here. How are these blood vessels structurally and physiologically different? Where does the exchange of materials in the blood take place? What properties of blood must change in order for this change to take place? So if we look at this, the two most important things, all right? So, if you're thinking about Amazon and all your deliveries, and maybe they come by air, they come by boat, they come however, and they're traveling at pretty high speeds, right? Maybe under a lot of pressure, depending on who's driving the bus. But that's what we talk about with respect to the artery, right? When we think of arteries and arterioles, right? Arteries and arterioles have that thick muscular wall, and that creates a small lumen, which leads to an increased pressure and increased blood velocity. Well, the vessels can't maintain that increased pressure and increased blood velocity by the time they get to the capillaries, because these capillaries are just one cell layer thick. And that increased pressure and increased blood velocity would just literally rupture these tiny little capillaries. And so that can't happen. But what does happen is a change, a structural change that leads to a decrease in blood pressure and blood velocity. And it has to do with the fact that if we were to look at the cross-sectional area of all of the capillaries collectively, the actual cross-sectional area of all the capillaries collectively is significantly greater than the collective cross-sectional area of the arterioles leading in. And with this increased space comes a decrease in pressure and a decrease in blood velocity. So the increased cross-sectional area All right, increased cross-sectional area of the collective capillaries. And that's where the capillaries are so numerous, right? There's so many of them that their collective cross-sectional area increases, leading to, so increased cross-sectional area of the collective capillaries leads to a decrease in blood pressure, and therefore ultimately a decrease in blood velocity, allowing exchange to take place. So my analogy of the FedEx, the Amazon, the UPS delivery guy, however that package makes it to your house, it's traveling at high speed in the arteries, right? By air, by bus, by shipping crate, whatever. Like, it's making its move. But eventually, as we get down into smaller and smaller highways, roads, streets, back roads, it's got to go slower, right? Ultimately, it's got to get to the point where, the driver's able to deliver the package to your doorstep. In the same way as blood travels through your arteries at high pressure, high velocity, branching off into these arterioles, blood pressure starting to drop a little bit, blood velocity starting to drop, eventually getting to the capillaries where it becomes significantly less to allow the actual exchange to take place. And this would be what it looks like graphically. All right, so here we've got the main artery coming in, right? So we've got the main artery coming into a particular location. This could be your kidneys, right? It could be your renal artery as an example. And it's branching into many arterioles, right? And these arterioles eventually branch into many capillaries, right? So we've kind of got this sort of thing going on. Okay, so look at what's happening to blood pressure and blood velocity as it makes the transition from arteries to arterioles to capillaries. So the up and down, right, is essentially your pulse and your heart rate, right? Beating heart. So we get an increased pressure when the hearts contract, right? When the ventricles contract and force blood into our arteries. We get a drop when the ventricles relax and fill up again. And then we get an increase again when they contract, and so on and so forth. That's our regular heartbeat. And that velocity would follow suit, right? When the ventricles contract, pushing blood into the arteries, the pressure goes up, velocity goes up. When the heart relaxes, the ventricles relax, blood pressure drops, velocity drops, and so forth. And that's fairly constant, but as it starts to move into the smaller and smaller blood vessels, the increased surface area of the arterioles over the arteries collectively leads to a drop in that blood pressure, which leads to a corresponding drop in blood velocity, to the point where eventually we get into the capillaries, the blood pressure drops off significantly and the blood velocity drops off, because as we can see, what's happened is the total cross-sectional area has increased significantly. So it's the reverse analogy before of the garden hose, right? When we put our thumb over the end of that garden hose and shrunk the diameter, pressure went way up, velocity went way up. Here, we're now going from a small garden hose, excuse me, to a bigger garden hose. And as we go to a bigger garden hose, well, blood pressure is going to drop and velocity is going to drop. And this allows the exchange to take place. All right. We can see as we move into the venules, don't forget, the venules might have a smaller cross-sectional area than capillaries, but they're significantly bigger than the arteries and arterioles, and blood pressure and blood velocity don't typically recover. Surface area drops off, but blood pressure, remember, isn't restored and those veins are relying on our skeletal muscles to push on them as our muscles contract, as you shift in your chair, as you stand up and go for a walk, etc. All the action of your skeletal muscles pushes on those veins, pushing blood back towards the heart with the valves to control the backflow, prevent the backflow. So those are the physiological conditions that occur, right? A difference in the anatomy leads to differences in the physiological conditions, differences in blood pressure. Well, we could start with differences in area, lead to differences in pressure, which lead to differences in velocity. And those changes structurally lead to the changes physiologically that then lead to the allowing of tissue fluid exchange. And the tissue fluid exchange isn't all that different than what we talked about with respect to internal and external respiration, where we talked about the exchanges of gases, which is driven by changes of partial pressure. And this holds true with respect to tissue fluid exchange. The only difference is here, we're not just talking about the exchange of gases. Here we're focusing on the exchange of nutrients, right? The delivery of glucose and amino acids, or the delivery of hormones, or the removal of wastes like carbon dioxide or urea, which we talked about the liver, right? The liver in its process of deamination and breaking proteins down produces a waste product, urea, right? So we're talking about the exchange of nutrients to the tissue and removal of waste from the tissue. But the same concepts apply that applied in exchange of gases. And it's all driven by pressure. So as we're entering into the tissue, okay, we've got, think of the arterial end being rich in nutrients, right? So we're high in oxygen and nutrients. And so when you're full of solutes, right, the pressure is going to be high. So we've got a high pressure at the arterial end, high pressure that drives the diffusion, right, of everything, water, nutrients, and we should be specific, right? I'm using nutrients to be quick, but glucose, amino acids, right, etc. And even oxygen, right? We've got the high pressure region inside the arterial end versus low pressure out here, right? Which drives the movement of those materials out. And as the blood starts to lose all those solutes, you can see that the hydrostatic pressure of the blood would start to drop. 35 millimeters of mercury on this side, 15 millimeters of mercury on this side. So now we've got a smaller hydrostatic pressure inside, larger osmotic pressure in the tissues. So we've got high pressure now in the tissues coupled with this lower pressure inside the vessel, and we start pushing things out. And again, remember, things are going to go from high concentration or high pressure to low. So whereas CO2 is going to be high in this region here, right, and wastes are going to be high, they're therefore going to be forced out into the blood. Wastes like urea, CO2, right, other nitrogenous wastes. We'll talk more about those in the excretory system, right? But we've got those things moving out. And that's it. That's the fundamental laws that govern tissue exchange. So you want to make sure that you understand how the structural changes in the blood vessels lead to this decrease, right? This decrease in blood pressure and decrease in blood velocity, right? That's important for two things, right? One, I said the pressure has to drop or these tiny little capillaries would just burst, but the velocity also has to drop as well. Like if you think of the guy flying by with your package, right? I mean, if he doesn't slow down, there's maybe not quite as good a chance he's going to be able to exchange the package to your front door, right? Unless he hurtles it out the window. So in the same respect, the blood has to slow down and give time for all of this exchange of materials, right? So changes structurally lead to drop in blood pressure, drop in blood velocity, and then the differences in pressure drive materials out at one end, right? Remember that arterial end, materials are leaving. And of course, again, blood is high in glucose, high in nutrients, amino acids, etc., right? So that stuff is going to go from high to low. And we're going to probably lose some water over here or retain some water back, right? So even though we lost water over here, we're probably going to get some back here. That maintains that stable blood pressure. Okay, stay tuned for the next video.